afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for coming. My name is Brian Rosenblum, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities with RA&Y. And we're really thrilled today to have Mark Sample here for our seminar. Mark's from George Mason University, where he is associate professor in the Department of English. He's also an affiliated faculty member with GMU's Undergraduate Honors College, his Cultural Studies doctoral program, and the Center for History and New Media. Mark's research focuses on contemporary fiction, electronic literature, and video games. He has a book about creative computing and a Commodore 64 computer forthcoming from MIT Press. He has work in a book called Hacking the Academy, which is a crowdsourced scholarly book forthcoming from University of Michigan Press. He's a contributor to the Prof Hacker column in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he also writes for Play the Past, which is a collaboratively edited scholarly blog that explores the intersection of cultural heritage and games. And so a lot of Mark's all over online. You can find plenty of his writing, and we're happy to have him here to talk about playing without power, video games, agency, and form. So please welcome Mark.
Thank you, Brian, for having me. And I just got tired of you saying all that stuff. They didn't do it all at once. It sounds like a lot all at once. And I also want to give a shout out to, I have two former students, Jake and Lauren, who drove from Kansas City to come here today. They graduated in Mason 2 or 3 years ago.
This past May.
Whatever.
It feels like
it feels like a long time. But thank you everyone for having me. This is my first time at the University of Kansas, so I'm thrilled to be here. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to say something about my title, Playing Without Power. As one is wont to do, I had the title before I had the talk itself. And so this notion of playing without power is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's really just a small piece of my next research project. But I've been thinking the main ideas with playing without power is that video games are often described by players and scholars alike as fantasies about unlimited power. And the typical trajectory of a video game, especially like a big budget video game, is for a relatively powerless protagonist to level up and gain increasingly more power, more health, more abilities. And I'm interested in video games that challenge that paradigm. And I'll get to an example of that later today, but before I do that, because my sense is that the general field of video game studies is relatively new to many people, that I say I just kind of paint a picture of what video game studies looks like right now. So we understand video games by playing them. Card games, board games, video games, each of these, their idiosyncrasies and their dynamics become clear, not when we read the instructions. If you've ever read a complicated board game set of instructions, you know this. It's not the instructions that help you understand what the game is, it's actually playing the game. That's when we really understand what the game is about. Play is, as Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman, who are two video game designers and theorists, describe it, play is free movement within a more rigid structure. And when we, the players, bump up against the structure, which could be the rules, the boundaries, the mechanics of the game, that's revealed the contours of the game, slowly uncovering what Lovmanovich calls the game's hidden logic. So this is how we come to know games, by experiencing. Like all cultural activities, however, games can be approached through a means apart from the simple playing them. Games can be played, but they can also be interpreted. The early years of video game studies were defined by this tension. Were games mainly about rules, structure, and play, or did games tell stories, contain allegories, and reenact social dramas? And I love this picture. This is actually from the version of Stratego that I think was a Milton Bradley game that I grew up with. And the picture on the box actually is reenacting some power dynamics between the father and the rest of the family that you might not get just playing the game itself, of course. So, were games about rules, structure, and play, or did games tell stories and reenact social dramas? Self-proclaimed ludologists, and they took that name, ludology, from the Greek word ludus, games, Neurologists argued for the former, while many others defended the latter. And the debate played out in the early years of the new millennium in conferences, blogs, scholarly journals like Game Studies, Electronic Review. In this time period I'm talking about, this debate is like roughly 1995 to 2005. In one famous exchange, Espen Arseth argued, quote, "The dimensions of Lara Croft's body are irrelevant to me as a player." Whatever Lara Croft looked like, as Arseth maintained, it had no impact on the gameplay itself. Lara Croft's body didn't tell you anything about the game. To which Stuart Malthoff, another really important theorist, who's more frequently associated with electronic literature, Stuart Malthoff replied, "It seems unlikely that Mr. Bean Tomb Raider would sell nearly as well to his primary audience. Lara Croft's physique may consist of raw data, but it cannot be treated as such for critical purposes," Malthoff maintained. So the look of Lara Croft, that's not Lara Croft, I'm sorry. The look of Lara Croft or Mr. Bean may not have changed the core dynamics of the game, but it did, Malthoff argued, change the meaning of the game. Another prominent example in this debate between ludologists and narratologists, although that word narratology is not the same kind of narratology that's associated with Jerry Prince or Gerard Jeanette. Tetris. This was a game that came up frequently. We all know Tetris. I like this example because it's just what everyone can relate to it. So in 1997, in one of the really foundational books in new media studies, Hamlet on the Holodeck by Janet Murray, Murray called Tetris, quote, "a perfect enactment of the overtasked lives of Americans in the 1990s, of the constant bombardment of tasks that demand our attention and that we must somehow fit into our overcrowded schedules and clear off our desks in order to make room for the next onslaught." So that was her take on Tetris, to which another ludologist criticized her, and this ludologist is Markku Eskelinen from Finland. He said, "Instead of studying the actual game, Murray tried to interpret its supposed content, or better yet, project her favorite content onto it. Consequently, we don't learn anything of the features that make Tetris a game." In many ways, Eskelinen is, here's the point. Murray took a game written in 1984 by a Soviet engineer and read it as a middle-class American academic in the mid-1990s. But at the same time, doesn't Murray's allegorical reading of the game capture the spirit of Tetris in a meaningful way? So we're left with this question. What's the difference between the mechanics of the game of Tetris, which I don't have to describe. You rotate 4 different blocks to fill in the rows so that those blocks disappear and you keep stacking them up. And actually trying to keep them from rising. What's the difference between that mechanic and the skin of the game, the look of the game, the visual themes of the game? And the game designer Ray Foster asked exactly this question about Tetris. And he posed this thought experiment. This is a drawing that he made on his book. Consider a game, Foster wrote, of mass murder where you throw victims down a well and they stand on each other to try and climb out. The mechanics of the game remain the same, but suddenly the game takes on a dark tone, far darker than the perfect reenactment of American life that Murray wrote about. Now, Foster's proposal was a thought experiment. But of course, in a world of video games, if you can imagine it, you can build it. And that's exactly what a Brazilian game studio did just a few years ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago. They designed this game. My Brazilian is not too good, but this translates roughly into the gloomy dungeon or the lurid dungeon. And let me just replay this. So just like Tetris, I can. I'm not very good at Tetris, but you can rotate your figures and you can see the close up. They're units in different shapes. I'm not going to take too long. I just want to make it really simple. So, you got that, right? So, let me turn the line. And we'll leave it run in the background so you can see what happens when I lose the game. So this game transforms the meaning of Tetris. You're put in the ghastly position of the torturer, or if not the torturer himself, then the conspirator who makes his job possible. And now we'll watch the bodies have risen out of the pit, and they come after the torturer. So as you're playing the game, if you're playing it properly, correctly, as you are used to playing Tetris, you are aiding the torturer. You're literally hiding the bodies. And Tetris is no longer about the hectic pace of American life. Obviously, it's about a totalitarian regime's obsession with power, control, and bloody efficiency. It's a theme all the more striking when you consider the game's origins in Brazil, which did have a progressive totalitarian regime in the 60s and 70s. In my mind, I'll close this so that. In my mind, the divide between modology and the narrativist approach to games, which we might reductively think of as a split between form and content, it's a distraction. I and many scholars in the field have come to recognize that no single approach to video games can adequately explore their rich cultural significance. In fact, the latest trends in video game research have suggested that both approaches fall prey to what Nick Montfort has called screen essentialism. Screen essentialism occurs when the digital event on the screen, as Matthew Kirschenbaum puts it, becomes the sole object of study at the expense of the underlying software, hardware, storage devices, and even non-digital and inputs and outputs that make the screen event possible in the first place. So one response to screen essentialism has been Nick Montfort and Ian Bogos's development of platform studies. This is kind of a methodological approach. It's also the name of the book series that they're editing for MIT Press. Unlike the typical screen-centric approaches to born digital works, platform studies. That was my game. Platform studies considers both the software and hardware of systems, exploring the relationship between these hidden foundations and the more visible, creative, and expressive acts that appear on the surface of the machine. Every platform is a composite of chips and hardware, controllers, circuits, software, storage devices, and so on. And each of these components offers affordances, capabilities that are both limiting and enabling. The Montfort and Bogos break down platform studies into 5 different layers, each of which can be explored more thoroughly by humanists. And they really do want humanists to approach technology this way. There are different versions of this system they have designed. Sometimes I like to draw it as a pyramid because many times what is possible on the upper levels is constrained by the lower levels. But at the base is the platform, the actual physical hardware the game is on. And we tend to think of platform as like name brands. There's Sega Genesis, the PlayStation, the Xbox, the iPad. But Montfort and Bogos think of platform more generally as just any kind of system that can be programmed, any programmable system. So a platform studies approach that focuses on the hardware reveals, for instance, and this is some of the work that they have done, the Atari 2600, the Atari 2600, which was the first really important home video console. It had this unique television adapter interface that really constrained what the graphics looked like and the playability of the games. It shaped the games themselves. And the 2600 port of Pac-Man is probably the most dramatic example of this. And if you've ever played real Pac-Man in an arcade, you know it looks nothing like this. So going back to their system here of platform studies, I don't have to go through all these in much detail, but there's the platform, the hardware of the system, and above that is the code. And what code you can run on any given system often depends upon the hardware. The form above that, this is what video game studies has often looked at, the function of the games, what's actually happening there on the screen, the mechanics, the sound, the visuals. The interface is something that humanists in particular have not often considered, the way that certain interfaces actually influence what you can do with the game, the meaning that the game has. But as the interfaces become branched out from just keyboards and mice, and now we have Next and PlayStation Move and touchscreens, I think people are starting to think more about interfaces. Reception and operation is how people use the games, what they make of them, what the games have as an afterlife, if they're modded, if they're hacked, these kind of things. This is something sociologists and anthropologists have studied more than humanists, I think. And finally, bounding all of these is the culture and context. This is, at every step along this ladder of platform studies, culture is kind of pressing in from all these different layers. Now, what I like about platform studies is that it actually seems it has many affinities to discipline or an approach that's more familiar to my own discipline. I'm coming from an English department. So it's textual studies. Textual studies with its awareness of the social and material history of text. It comes closest, I think, to this idea of platform studies. The concerns of textual studies, attention to physical form, recognition that hands other than the author shape the text, an almost forensic desire to trace the history of marginalia, errata, and variance. They all have their analogs and emerging strengths in the studies. And so now I'm going to look at a game that's informed by this platform studies approach. In particular, I'm going to dive in at the level of code, which was on the chart there. And I'm going to do this with this game called JFK Reloaded. Is everybody familiar with this game? Okay. Many people, if they have heard of it, it's, as you can imagine, in slightly negative terms. This is a first-person shooter released by the now-defunct Traffic Software in 2004, in which the first-person shooter happens to be Harvey Oswald. The player assumes Oswald's role with the goal of reenacting the shooting at Dealey Plaza with as much fidelity as possible to the findings of the Warren Commission report. That is, Oswald acted alone, fired 3 bullets from a single rifle from the 6th floor of the Texas School of Photography. So let me show you a few minutes of me playing the game. So this is a screen capture that I made myself. I'm in the school repository. I can zoom in and so as you might imagine, the game raised considerable outrage in the media when it was released. The Kennedy family themselves called the game despicable. Many scholars, however, argue that no matter how tasteless the game might be, JFK Reloaded represented a legitimate engagement with history. Traffic, the developer, labeled JFK Reloaded a docu-game, and most critical readings of the game see it as a form of interactive documentary. Tracy Fullerton places the game squarely within Michael Grimmel's classic definition of documentary media, as the game, quote, interrogates the past. Cindy Paremba argues that the game is not about the past per se, but about the limits of historical archives and documentary evidence. And we can see this in the game's forensic imagination. Whoops, I will watch it again. Whenever you finish up the gameplay, you can see all sorts of forensic evidence. The game generates a ballistics report for every shot fired, and it also includes summary forensic analysis of what you just scored there. More recently, Ian Lagos, Simon Ferrari, and Bobby Schweitzer suggested in both news games that JFK Reloaded is a very specific kind of documentary game. They describe 3 different playable realities that documentary video games can simulate in the name of understanding the past. A spatial reality in which players explore the physical environment of a historical event. And a recent example would be Osama bin Laden's Abbottabad compound, which a modder created in Counter-Strike just days after the assassination of bin Laden. So there's a playable kind of a spatial reality, an operational reality, which recreates specific events, hewing to the historical record, and finally a procedural reality, which models, quote, the behaviors underlying the situation rather than merely telling the stories of their effects. And this might be a city simulation or something like that. So according to this framework, JFK Reloaded presents the player with an operational reality. Players recreate in a structured, limited way, and guided by their own historical knowledge, the essential operations of the game. Waiting for the motorcade to approach from the hidden perch, sighting the rifle off the cars, firing into the motorcade. This operational reality is configurable, as you can see here in the game options, where I can decide how much blood I want and things along those lines. You can, the motorcade behavior, we can actually make it harder to hit the motorcade by making it drive rapidly. So the fact that you can configure these suggests that there's more to JFK Reloaded than a simple attempt to recreation of a historical event. As Bogus notes in Persuasive Games, which is work that precedes news games, it's nearly impossible to win JFK Reloaded, by which I mean match the war conditions for fantasies. The website is no longer up. This is a screen capture of maybe 2008 or something from there. It went on sale for $5, originally like $12. But anyways, Bogus suggests that impossibility is itself like a kind of procedural rhetoric, a form of procedural reality layered upon a more explicit operational reality. As Bogus puts it, the developer's stated goal of reaffirming the Warren Commission report was a ruse. And in fact, I would add, the game highlights the precise opposite of its proclaimed goal, the improbability of the Warren Commission's findings. So whether or not the procedural report by the procedural rhetoric of JFK Reloaded supports or refutes the Warren Commission report, it's possible to find traces of another narrative in the game by treating the game itself as a historical artifact, emerging out of a specific time and place, textured by the touch of countless hands. And to do this, I want to examine the code of the game. And to be more precise, I want to look at code comments that appear in one of the 2 WAD files that comprise JFK Reloaded's game assets. WAD is an acronym for Where's All the Data. It's a file that contains a collection of individual sounds, sprites, level information, non-playable character behavior, and other game data. These WAD files were first used by Doom in 1993, and now WADs are similar other files that are used in many PC games. So in the case of JFK Reloaded, opening up the core 000.wad file in a text editor reveals mostly strings of what look to be random letters and numbers. And that's because those are binary files that are not supposed to be read in the text editor. But about 2/3 of the way down in the file, actually line 224,070, there's a chunk of plain text code that resembles XML structured data, accompanied by full-line programmer comments. For example, these lines specify the actions that occur when a generic character is fatally hit by Oswald's rifle. It goes off the screen there, it doesn't fit all the way on, but notice the double slashes. Any line that begins with these double slashes is a comment in the code. Code comments pose a number of interesting technological challenges. From an outsider's perspective, in other words, from a non-programmer's perspective, it's tempting to think of code comments as a kind of textual marginality. The notes, corrections, and even doodles that authors and readers often add in the margins of text. They are ignored by the machine interpreter, but readable by humans, but not exactly legible, because you have the big line in front of them. Jerry Douglas has convincingly characterized comments in code as a kind of paratext, as he says it, continuous with and yet set apart from the source of it. They are not intended for the end user, but with the right tools, the end user may find them. They exemplify what Mark Marino has called the extra-functional significance of code, meaning making that goes beyond the purely utilitarian commands in software code. Extra-functional significance means that the code participates in a system of signs beyond those executable by the machine. So, for instance, in the following system of code in the laws, Jackie Kennedy's actions are defined. The comment provides the context for these lines of codes, the kind of textual marginality left by the programmer. Perhaps as a quick note to himself, perhaps for other programmers working on the code, we don't know. But the casual use of the phrase money shot is striking. While it's tempting to suggest that the code sheds some light on the developer's attitude towards the subject matter, what we call tone, literary studies, I don't think it's necessary to do so. This comment is structurally unnecessary, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean. This phrase, money shot, is inexorably linked to pornography, referring to the climactic and very visible scene of male ejaculation in pornographic film. Sorry, you didn't know I was even talking about that. Wasn't on my abstract. So the money shot is given this name because in the porn industry because it's typically the most expensive scene to shoot. It's also, as Linda Williams argues, the most, quote, representative instance of power and pleasure in a hardcore film. This is from Linda Williams' really insightful and rigorous study of pornography called Hardcore. Williams positions the money shot as a dense collision point between commodity fetishism, visual desire, and anxiety over women's, quote, invisible and unquantifiable pleasure. In more ways than one, the money shot is, as Williams puts it, a substitute for what cannot be seen. The money shot comment in JFK Reloaded reenacts this substitution and reverses it. Consider the comment closely. Jackie craving JFK before the money shot. While Kennedy is nominally the target in JFK Reloaded, describing the fatal gunshot as a money shot substitutes Jackie as the intended target. In heteronormative pornography, it is the man who delivers the money shot and the one who receives it. Jackie thus becomes an unwilling participant in a death scene that is pornographic in nature, while the player is given license to fulfill the role of the male performer in a pornographic film. In other words, imagining Oswald's bullseye as a money shot makes it okay to try to hit Jackie. Jackie Kennedy is not collateral damage, but in fact was the target all along. Yet the comment also reverses the usual dynamic of the money shot, which makes visible that which would otherwise be hidden in the intercourse. So in the case of JFK Reloaded, it's the money shot that is in the comment itself that's supposed to be hidden. It's inside the code of the game, unavailable to the player, off limits. And whether it's there as an inside joke or an offhand remark with no connection in the programmer's mind to pornography, it's still there. It means something. It cannot not mean something. In the same way the game's forensic imagination interprets our chaotic gunshots, our own critical forensic imagination must reckon with this comment. Once it's known, it cannot be undone. To ignore the comment means overlooking the kind of evidence that historians and media scholars have long used to create a more complex understanding of our cultural heritage. At the very least, the strictly objective perspective that we falsely associate with documentary media is also here. The misogynistic tone of the comments becomes even more troubling in the next snippet, which defines Nellie Connolly's actions when her husband, the Texas Governor John Connolly, is shot. In 3 lines of code commentary here, the developers at Traffic absolutely undermine the entire stated pedagogical project of their document. They're outwardly, and this is a quote from their website, interactive reconstruction of John F. Kennedy's assassination, end quote, is undone by inaccuracies. The suggestion that Connolly probes, and misspellings, they get Nellie's name wrong and misspelled this word, but even more so by an explicitly pornographic and misogynistic reframing of this traumatic event. This comment marks the second time that a grieving woman protecting her injured husband is portrayed in JFK Reloaded as transgressively sexual in a moment of pain and suffering, not to mention a moment of national crisis. Well, the concern variable initiates an in-game routine appropriate for the situation. The hidden code retells the story almost as a snuff film. The governor's critical wound is not with arousal, and Nellie's desperation is sexual, not emotional. Simulated the direst of situations, a national tragedy, but also a personal one, this first-person shooter collapses sex onto violence. They are indistinguishable from each other, but only in the comments. The late German media theorist Friedrich Hitler argued, as Alexander Galloway puts it, code is the only language that does what it says. And my response to that is, yes, code does what it says, but also says things it does not mean. The rhetorical excess of the comments in the code of JFK not only undermines practice-official rationale for the game, the comments complicate the arguments of players who defended the game. Access to the code allows us to write a revisionist history of JFK Reloaded. The game is about power, but a different kind of power than what players had suspected. It's not about the power of a disturbed assassin, it's about the power of male video game players and designers. Seen in this light, Lee Harvey Oswald is an even bigger pawn than most conspiracy theories make him out to be. Yet how far should we go in letting what is essentially the marginality of the game, which was never intended to be available to the player, guide our interpretation of the game? I like to think of comments in code, and indeed software code in general, as what the textual scholar Jerry McGann calls a social private text. McGann is primarily discussing poetry, but his definition of a text as a, quote, laced network of linguistic and bibliographic codes would certainly include computer code. Texts are produced and reproduced under specific social and institutional conditions, McGann explains. And hence, he says, every text, including those that may appear to be purely private, is a social text. So video game code is a social text, I'm arguing. The rhetorical excess of the comments in JFK Reloaded's code spills over, making the supposedly private text palpably social. Programmer comments in no way help us to understand what Bogus would call the procedural rhetoric of the game. They don't help us explain the events on the screen. Yet they do help us develop an understanding of the game as a cultural object and of coding itself as a cultural practice. Especially in the case of JFK Reloaded, the comments are an expression of the male-dominated, conquest-driven milieu of contemporary gaming and coding, which the indie designer Anna Anthropy has recently stewarded in her book, The Rise of the Video Game Zinster. Furthermore, the comments show us that the inside of software does not necessarily match the outside. They help us to avoid screen essentialism. The screen we play our games on is precisely that, a screen. And behind it are things we must acknowledge and start to understand in video game studies. And of course, one of these things that this game captures, JFK Reloaded, is its kind of uncritical use of history. For the next few minutes, I actually want to look at another game that is of this particular historical moment, as right now. Whereas JFK Reloaded is full of unquestioned power dynamics, this is a game that takes a much more skeptical view of force and power. And this is a game called Unmanned. Has everybody heard of Unmanned? Yeah, this is fairly new. It came out in the past 6 months. Unmanned is by the Italian game designer Paolo Pedicini, who releases games under the name Bully Industrial. In Unmanned, the player assumes the role of a drone operator in the United States' counterterrorism program. So in some ways, the game is similar to JFK Reloaded when you describe it as you're trying to kill them. But it's a lot different than that. The game never uses the language. It's kind of left up to the player to figure out exactly what's going on. But the player assumes the role of a pilot of an RQ-1 Predator RPA, which is remotely piloted aircraft. The Predator and its newer, more powerful sibling, the MQ-9 Reaper, are also called more generally UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. So unmanned is where this game gets its name. The U.S. military and government never refer to these aircraft as drones, and neither does the game. And before I show you the game, let's just look at the cramped cockpit of a Predator control station. Here's a remote pilot and sensor operator. They work side by side on the ground station, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away in the battleground. Many of the drone sorties that are flown in Yemen and Somalia for example, are controlled by pilots at Beach Air Force Base in Nevada or Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. The New York Times, among others, have reported recently about the growing psychological stress placed on drone pilots and sensor operators who might have to observe a family compound for weeks before they are given an order to kill an individual. This stress, coupled with the kind of survivor syndrome at not being in harm's way, which many of these pilots used to have with their F-16s, or on the ground where they would have to face IEDs, marks a turning point in modern warfare, which, actually, according to many soldiers, feels less like a video game and much more human and more intimate than we might imagine. And I think that's what this game tries to capture. So let me just show you a few minutes of this game. And this is new territory for me, so I haven't figured out what I was saying about the game. I'm going to just ask for input from everybody here about what they're noticing. The game starts with a split screen, which kind of trains us how to play the game. You can't proceed until you click on both of these screens. So before you come in, click before I start playing again, before the game actually starts playing. But just once I start clicking, my mouse controls the footsteps. This controls where this individual is going to walk. At the end of every level, you have a possibility of earning certain medals. So I'm just like from this opening screen, the opening segment of the game. What did you notice? What's going on? That's happened to me in my classes.
Well, I mean, the first thing you notice is it's all about drones because, people always talk about drones kind of displacing you from the actual event. But here you have this guy with blonde hair in the middle of somewhere in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So got an active place right in the middle of it, and then you see him wake up. So he's clearly placing himself in the role of the drone.
Yeah, I mean, we're in his mind, and we see him, at least subconsciously, placing himself in this arena where he's not. What about the split screen function? Really interesting function. Yeah.
It seemed to me that I don't know if they were trying to create some kind of anti-Muslim narrative going on, that while he's sleeping, when he sees Muslims coming at him, or digitized versions of Muslims, that there would be more panic, right, on the left. But it was very calm. There was no sensation of fear being displayed until he turns into a drone and flies away.
Yeah, that's the moment when he wakes up.
I mean, that's the nightmare part. At least that's what I got.
Right. Well, let's look. I mean, the game is divided into these different levels, and what's amazing to me is the game takes maybe 15 minutes to play, so I'm not going to play the whole game. But the actual flying a drone part is very, very small. There are all sorts of other things. So, for instance, the day begins, and we get to shake in the morning. Not many video games about modern warfare feature a scene where you have to shake. And we have to make a choice, and this is how the game is structured. We have to decide which which sentiment most clearly mirrors our own as we play it, or if you're like me, you want to kind of push at the boundaries of the system, and you see what I'm curious to see what different sentiments lead to. But we can take a kind of very introspective approach, a very pragmatic approach, and a national security approach. Probably interesting. Let me get shade. Oh, we're going to cut myself. That means I don't keep that. So let's see if I cut myself too. Okay, so then I can make a choice over here. So there are any metals in this stage. One of the metals is the metal for shading. Another is a metal for introspection. And it's really interesting to see what these metals are named after. And then the next scene is I'm driving to the drone station. And you can see I still have that. And this is actually a reference, and there are many references in the game to other video games. The way that I'm describing on this road is a reference to Desert Bus Ride, which is an infamous game that was never released, but was designed by Penn and Teller, in which you drive a desert bus from like Albuquerque to Las Vegas. Las Vegas is your destination, and it's in real time. So it's 12 hours of driving. And the bus drifts to the left, so you have to pay attention to it. And at the end, when you get there, you get 1 point. So again, you have these different choices. So I'm on autopilot. The idea that the unmanned starts to develop different meanings as you go through the game. There's the sense that it's dehumanizing, but also emasculating. There's some of that kind of thing. So unmanned doesn't just refer to unmanned. If you crash your car, the game builds in this, like, most gamers would call it boring, but it's I think meant to be a moment of introspection. So I'll take a vote from the audience. Am I wondering if Mikey has his doctorate appointment today, or if James on my shift? And we don't know who these people are at this point. What you guys want?
James.
All right, let's hear that. Okay, so what do I think now?
I take orders from her all
I think on radio thing, there are other references to kind of remote control and receiving signal from So what comes up next is a little mini game where he's going to start singing and trying to get the lyrics right. I think choose between these two lyrics. This is everybody know that song?
It's Queen, I think.
It's Queen. One Vision.
One Vision.
Yes. So, and when you look at all the lyrics, they're very evocative. So before I suit off and go to my drone station, before we talk about this. So what about the car driving sequence? Is there anything that kind of sticks out here?
Well, it occurs to me, you normally put facilities out in the middle of nowhere so nobody can observe the facility or can restrict the actions of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, with something like this, you could put it on the top of a skyscraper in downtown LA if you wanted to. I mean, there's almost the psychological purpose of putting the driver at least halfway to the combat zone.
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to be downtown LA to do this. You have to at least be in the Queens of New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at least be in the desert.
I think part of that, yeah.
Right? You know, get in the mood.
I think part of that is because they're placed at existing Air Force bases, which have been out in the middle of nowhere. I'm curious about that scene where the camera's pulling back and we see the globe more holistically.
I mean, it is interesting. The whole thing. I mean, definitely, there's no inkling of an organism, right? You see this sort of unmanned vehicle driving too, but there's a lot of reference to like a militaristic vision, right? Like GPS or satellite orbit, sort of this privileged, well, now declassified vision of what space is supposed to be like. I mean, even driving through that desert. Not that it means nothing, not that it's a non-place, but I mean to really kind of, even if you wanted to find that military base, you almost need some augmented vision to do it, and we're not even privy to that. It's just kind of nothing. So, I don't know, just something about the globe read to me as looks like GPS, satellite, military technology, something, but maybe I'm really not looking too crazy.
I don't know myself. I mean, as I said, I'm asking you to do my work for me. But it seems to be some sort of totalizing view. And then, so we're at the station, and this is when you describe this game, and this is the game about a drone pilot and sensor. This is the part of the game that they imagine that the game is really about, not the fact that you have to shave and drive and work to get there. So I'm going to kind of find it. So the other part, I didn't realize this until I played the game several times. You're not playing the pilot of the game, the person who actually pilots the aircraft. All these ground stations have two people, the pilot and the sensor operator who controls the cameras and all the other covert imaging and detection devices. So I think it's significant that this guy is the sensor, as if he's supposed to have some other. As if he's supposed to somehow be more in tune with things. But I'll start here. So basically, this kind of boring task is following this person. You can see down here, those are my 2 Hellfire missiles that my Predator drone is on. The Jane the pilot. And as a sensor, I have to say and just as in real life, this conversation I'm having with Jane keeps distracting me from what I was supposed to have.
My perverse gamer side wants to know what happens if you launch a missile.
All right.
Oops.
But what happened is not much of consequence. We have some form. And of course, I don't get the medal. The heart-shaped medal was to measure how well my flirting with Jane had proceeded. And then I get to have a cigarette smoke where I call my wife. And this is where we come through. We have a wife. And here, if you can see the lung icon, this is for me to drag on a cigarette. So again, there are all these ways of slowly dying, like the car crash or the cigarettes, which actually don't take effect in the game, but are not what you expect in a game about pilots. I think I'll kind of wrap it up there. What happens is the game goes on, and the next sequence is I'm back in the drone station, and I do receive orders to engage. So I kind of jumped the gun here, but I do get to do that later. And then I get to go home, and I end up going home to my kid, where I start playing video games with him, and war video games, in which I don't win. Like the guy, this character here is very bad at video games. And then finally he goes to bed, and it ends like it begins with him in bed, and he's counting sheep as they jump the fence. And the fence looks like a Pong game, one of the very first popular video games, arcade games. And if the sheep don't make the fence, they blow up. And that's how the game ends. So I'm thinking about this game. And again, I don't have any grand conclusions about it. But as a game that's meditating upon force and power and showing, complicating the notion of power. So in any other video game or many other video games, the player protagonist who's operating a missile, he's in a powerful position. But this game is constantly trying to underline that or complicate it or show some sort of psychological insights into it. So this is like where I'm going now with the game, and there are things we can do similar to what I have done with GFK Reloaded. We can access all the code of the game, and because this was produced under Creative Commons license. And I can look at all the different possibilities. I can see all the choices that are available to the player. And one of the things I noticed most recently looking at the code is how often blood comes up. Like, there's blood here from the shade, but there are other scenes as well where blood is named as a variable, which is very kind of jarring juxtaposition to have blood in this game that's kind of very slow, and the blood is always the player's blood and not the terrorists who are liberated kind of bloodlessly. But I think I'll stop there and just kind of open up the questions about this game, about JFK Reloaded, about video game studies in general.
The historiographer has got to wonder who's causing the game. I mean, obviously there's an author, which we normally want to know about him, but who's causing the game to be made, and who do they think the audience should be?
For this game or for the JFK?
Well, actually, yeah, for anything, but this one in particular, since it does run so contrary to normal shoot 'em up.
Mm-hmm. Well, this game is the man. It's kind of like a one-man operation, but he has this collective name. He calls it a collective, but he basically does all the games himself. And he's constantly trying to create these games that are what some people say are art games. And I think he actually rejects the term art games because that makes them sound kind of domesticated or something like that. And he's trying to be a little bit more radical than that. But some of his other games are the McDonald's game, in which you are responsible for basically running the entire McDonald's corporation from the farm, from the beef farms in Brazil to soybean production in the States, to what prices are in the in the actual restaurants. And you quickly see the only way to sustain it is by basically destroying, using all sorts of pesticides and bribing people. And it's a very as you're playing the game, it's very clear what his agenda is and what his view is. I like this game because it's more subtle. It's not just doesn't come out saying drones are bad or it doesn't blame people.
This one seems practically an interactive poem.
Yeah,
meditative,
mm-hmm.
bloody.
It is bloody, yeah. Yeah. Good.
Well, you had asked earlier what the significance of the dual screens are, and as I was playing it, I think a lot of it has to do with when we play games, there's kind of a divorce between the player and the player character because, there's like you talked about how there's, the events going on the screen, but then you're also sitting in your living room, your office, wherever you are, and so you also have to deal with the outside world. And here I think it kind of gets at the fact that, when you're having to go through all this dialogue, they could have easily just put this dialogue, as a subtitle on the main screen, but he specifically chooses to separate it so you have to be distracted from your driving or whatever you're doing. And to me, I think that gets you, it lets you kind of connect to the character more because, he's also a little bit disconnected from the events because he's having to, because he's on two separate planes as well. And then that also kind of goes into the whole drone thing where, where they're not actually where the events are happening.
Yeah, I think the split screen kind of resonates on all sorts of different levels, including those. Did you?
Well, he had a similar thought. I just saw a certain parallelism between the protagonist, for lack of a better word, controlling a drone and us as players sitting in our chairs controlling the actions of him. And I'm wondering if this is a critique on gamers in a certain way. It's almost like The Sims, but, where you cut yourself with, a razor. And I kind of think The Sims is a big joke criticizing people who play it as you have no life, but you're,
right.
You're playing a virtual life. I haven't played the whole game or anything, but there seems to be some critique there of the person who's controlling in real life.
I think it's in some ways you could call it a meta game, reflective on games themselves. It reminds me of I think it was the Onion had of course a fake article about the new mod, the new upgrade to World of Warcraft, in which you could play World of Warcraft and World of Warcraft. They were interviewing people talking about how much more lifelike it was going to be when you're playing this game instead of the game. And then, I'll just kind of jump through this conversation with my wife. So I'll show you that when he's playing the game, because we're playing the game, we're playing the character, playing a game. So we're at home with our son on the couch. And you can. All right. It's very cartoonish. Kind of looks like South Park. And then what happens is the son says, "This game is so boring. Let's play this other one that we've got." And you put it in, and it's the exact same game, except everyone's wearing World War II costumes or uniforms. So I mean, it's I think a critique on military games, on gaming itself.
And also, I mean, I wonder what the answer to that question is, because there is sort of this other social critique happening where in physical environment, we often see those training centers. I don't know if anybody's seen them, where it's sometimes in malls where you could go in and play a simulation, like flight simulations and things.
Right.
And it doubles as a game space and an army recruitment center. So
Right.
there is that sort of thing there too, especially when you have this at work, because those are sort of the, discursive constructions of gaming and military games that we have going on already. So
Yeah, all right.
it just extends what you were saying, I think.
I don't know if there's any really explicit critique, but from maybe 2002 to 2007, one of the most popular games was America's Army, which was a game designed by the U.S. Army, not explicitly as a recruiting tool, but it pretty much doubled as that. So the connection between military and gaming is inextricable. But I'll just, since we're already here, so I can choose to kind of critique my son's video game playing capabilities. I can be more concerned about what happened in school, prepare myself doctor. So, and I think there's something really oddly expressive, I find, about his face and the way he's blinking in the face of his son's So I'll take a game later. So the doctor's response about playing video games is that you should play this other kind of video game. And then his son kind of rubs in, that's not the right phrase, but it reminds this man that his job is not a dangerous job. The only injury he has sustained is shaving himself. And his son asks if it's a cheat code for black girls. And here you kind of are forced to make it's not exactly a moral decision, maybe a moral outlook on your actions. We're using drones because it's under the line. So this is where I said it's essentially the same game, but with a World War II background. I have I guess that's something. There's this sense that everyone's mediated by the screen. I think that's probably what the split screen first. So this badge was for being a good dad, and this was for winning those games. And then this is the policy. You can see the eyes close. As long as that's good. Let's see what I Well, what is that? So anything else? Like really kind of.
Do you think there's reference to and just looking at it, it's electric sheep, right? He's dreaming. It's like dream of electric sheep. I don't know. That's where I go.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, which would be another critique of that. Almost what you were talking about the split screen. It's like not a hyper reality, but a dual reality, almost like a cybernetic reality and real reality, right? So.
And the idea of drones.
Yeah, and what is real? You know, if you think about how that book was turned into Blade Runner and where that went, you know, are these memories implanted?
Yeah, I think it's really actually complicated. Oh, it's almost.
How do?
Okay. That was my first time reading. But then it has this kind of Victorian thing. But again, in general, I mean, these are the kind of games that are really, changing what it means to have power in video games, rethinking what power means in video games. Another one I had been planning on talking about but didn't have time is Flight to Freedom, in which you were playing a 14-year-old slave girl who is trying to just navigate plantation life and eventually perhaps escape to the north. And so the game is taking, you can't really get more vulnerable than this position that the player has to assume. And there are no power-ups. I mean, she doesn't get superpowers. You have to live this life as a 14-year-old slave child and escape to freedom. And these are the kind of games that I think I would like to see more video games, like the big name blockbuster games tackle some of these ideas as well. Any other questions? I don't know how long we're still.
usually goes over time, but
I'm sorry,
a few minutes per while.
we're chatting, but I think it's really an interesting provocative thought to look at the code comments and think of them as paratext, right? As sort of these tangential texts or ancillary texts that shape the meaning from the core text. And when we were going through the first one, I was like, that is fascinating because there's so many contradictions there on so many different levels. But I think that one of the things, as you mentioned, it really tells us about is almost the culture of labor and sort of the culture of the workplace behind the making of that particular game, right? And it almost read to me, it's like, let's do it for the lulz. Like, you're taking it too seriously. Why so serious about JFK's murder? Like, let's kind of play around with it. And a very sort of masculinist, obviously sexualized, heterosexual or heteronormative culture there. And I wonder, just thinking about that, I have a feeling that the code comments on the second game would reveal a totally different work culture and maybe heteronormativity. And although we do see that displayed in the text, I'm just wondering if you've done maybe a comparison.
I haven't. I've looked for comments in this one, and I haven't found any.
Yeah.
He's writing in. This is a Flash, so he writes in action script, and it doesn't seem like there's especially when he's writing for himself, the same kind of, he's developing by himself the same kind of need for comments. But, but the idea of like situating this within a workplace, I think is really important. I mean, I have friends who study writing in the workplace, and like they would love to be able to do ethnographic studies of software coders. And when I talk about this to some other people who have far more experience coding than I do, they basically said you're making too much out of it. That first comment about the money shot, maybe just the first coder put it in without even thinking. I mean, and then maybe someone else was coding later on and saw it and said, oh, let me riff on this with this second misogynistic example. And so maybe had no intent behind it whatsoever. But I do think it helps just lets us see this game in a new light. I mean, I don't, just because it wasn't intended, as I say, doesn't mean it's not there. And there have been other examples of this. I'm trying to think of the name. It was Dead Island. Is that the name? When Dead Island was released, like maybe a year and a half ago, someone was digging through the comments and the code, or digging through the code. This wasn't a comment. And then found out that one of the characters was, their variable name was feminist whore. And, I don't know much more about I mean, I didn't play the game. The game ended up not getting really good reviews aside from that. But the developer, not right away, but fairly quickly, acknowledged it and said if that was a leftover comment from somebody else, that person has been removed from the team. So it's interesting to see how companies respond to these concerns. And I think more and more modders are really interested in looking inside games and seeing what happens like this.
Well, and you're with this, between this and JFK Reloaded, you're kind of highlighting games taking more kind of political stances or current, attacking current events. So I think something else that's interesting is that this developer seems to be very interested in rhythm in life because, looking at one of the other games that you play in your class, Every Day the Same Dream, which is also about this kind of everyday routines, and it's very slow. And I think you've seen that a lot in independent games the past couple of years, is instead of things being more action-packed, things being slowed down and being about this kind of the process of things like the Invogo's A Slow Year, which is all about that, and then Dear Esther, which is just about walking around and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that there's this kind of a slow game movement where mostly independent designers are trying to push games in the same way that realist or naturalistic novelists were trying to push the novel to capture the rhythms and the intricacies and details of everyday life. Heavy Rain was a game that wasn't independently designed, but the game opens up with another shading scene. There are all sorts of things that happen at the beginning of the game that are very, very slow and meditative, which changes later on in the game, but it's something I think we are seeing more in games.
Another thing that the commenting in code makes me think of is just the versioning of the game. Because I know I can think of a few games off the top of my head, but also just in my own experience, that very often if you decide to change the plot of a game or something like that, you leave in the original and you'll just comment all that code out. Just in case, because then it becomes a resource for use later on. You don't want to delete it.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how that kind of affects or makes us rethink the game as a text.
Mm-hmm. No, a great example of this very thing was, so SimCity, you guys know SimCity? It's kind of a classic game designed by Will Wright and has been released for just about every other kind of platform imaginable. You play on the iPad. In the early 2000s, Electronic Arts, EA, who owned the rights to SimCity, released the code into the public domain. So they released the code as under the GPL license. And there was only one condition, apparently, was that whatever you did with the game, you couldn't call it SimCity. And so for the One Laptop Per Child initiative, in which different developers and researchers were trying to come up with a $100 laptop that they could send to third world countries and disadvantaged children and everything, they included all open source software on the One Laptop Per Child. And so they took this SimCity code, they renamed it Micropolis. And Micropolis was actually Will Wright's original name for what would become SimCity. And so you can play SimCity now as Micropolis on these One Laptop Per Child computers, or for Linux or any other kind of, it's been ported to all these different platforms. And the person who did the porting, who kind of revamped SimCity, was the person who, like a decade and a half earlier, had created one of the first ports of the original SimCity, which was on a Commodore 64 to a Unix machine. But anyway, when you start looking in the comments or to the code of Micropolis, there's one subroutine, and if you know the game, you know that disasters happen to your cities. Floods and earthquakes, and if you're playing Tokyo, Godzilla will come up from the sea. So in these lists of disasters, you can read they have commented out one of those disasters. And that disaster is a plane hitting the city. And the comment in the code explicitly says, EA asked us to remove this after 9/11. Mm-hmm. So that's a really kind of vivid example, I think, of this history that's buried in the code that someone playing the game would not have noticed. That maybe they would have realized that they were playing strong anymore, but they would never have known why. And then you can extrapolate from that, and EA actually has a record of revising games this way. I think was it Medal of Honor? Maybe or blanking on the name. Maybe 2 years ago, EA was releasing a game, a contemporary warfare game, in which you were explicitly fighting the Taliban. And people got upset about that. And EA kind of backed away. First they said, we're not going to change anything, we're not going to change anything. Then they changed it at the last minute to opposition force. So EA has this kind of history of avoiding history. Right, not acknowledging history. That's, I think, they've been more prominent in that regard than other studios. So yeah, there's a lot to go on there. And the problem that video game scholars and historians have is that we don't have access to a lot of things unless the code is available, and developers are they hold everything tightly. It's very rare that things are released into the open source world or public domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great, thank you.